All right, let's go. Number 10. Prehistoric gut microbiome management. Fermented food as medicine. In 10,000 BCE. In 2021, a team led by Christina Warrener at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published analysis of ancient dental calculus, hardened plaque that preserves biological material for thousands of years, from archaeological sites across Europe and the Near East. Among the findings, microbial DNA from fermented plant and dairy products was identifiable in the calculus of individuals dating to the Neolithic period, beginning approximately 10,000 BCE. This was not accidental consumption. The fermented products appeared at multiple sites across a wide geographic range, with evidence of intentional preparation and consistent use patterns suggesting purposeful dietary practice. The gut microbiome, the community of microorganisms inhabiting the human digestive system, was not named or understood as a concept until the late 20th century. The relationship between gut microbial diversity and immune function, mental health, inflammatory response, and metabolic health has been the subject of peer-reviewed research only in the last 2 decades. Specific probiotic interventions for specific conditions are still being validated in clinical trials. But here is where the timeline produces something that should stop you. The people of the early Neolithic, 12,000 years ago, were deliberately consuming specific fermented foods before agriculture was fully established, before cities existed, before any institutional framework for medical knowledge had developed. Whatever they observed about people who consumed fermented foods versus those who did not, they identified the correct intervention 12,000 years before the mechanism was understood. We did not discover probiotics. We rediscovered them. The knowledge existed, was practiced for millennia, and then was lost as Western medicine developed its pharmaceutical paradigm. The ancient dental calculus is in research collections. The microbial DNA has been sequenced, and the clinical literature confirming why those ancient practices worked is still being published. Number 9. Aboriginal Australian plant medicine. 40,000 years of pharmaceutical development. The Aboriginal Australian peoples represent the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Settlement in Australia dating to at least 65,000 years before present. Over this period, traditional healing knowledge was developed, tested, refined, and transmitted through an empirical tradition of observation and practice that has no parallel in duration anywhere on Earth. Ethnobotanist Philip Clark at the South Australian Museum has spent decades documenting Aboriginal Australian medicinal plant use. Pharmacological analysis of traditional preparations has produced a consistent finding. Approximately 25% of the traditional medicinal plant preparations tested show measurable biological activity relevant to their traditionally described therapeutic applications. In pharmaceutical drug development, the average success rate for compounds screened in preclinical development, selected using the full apparatus of modern chemistry and molecular biology, is approximately 1 to 5%. The traditional Aboriginal pharmacopoeia, developed through observation over 40,000 years with no understanding of molecular mechanisms, outperforms systematic modern screening by a factor of 5 to 20. But here is where the full implication becomes genuinely difficult to process. The 25% figure represents only the preparations that have been formally tested. The full body of Aboriginal Australian medicinal knowledge, thousands of plants, specific preparations, specific conditions, specific communities, has been documented in only a fraction of its actual scope. The majority exists only in the knowledge of traditional practitioners who are aging and whose transmission chains are under pressure from the same forces that have disrupted indigenous knowledge systems globally. We are not dealing with primitive remedies that occasionally work. We are dealing with the results of 40,000 years of systematic empirical pharmacology, the longest drug development program in human history. Some of the compounds in those plants may be the most effective treatments ever developed for specific conditions, and they will never reach a clinical trial because the knowledge of how to prepare and use them will die with the last practitioners who hold it. This is not a historical tragedy. It is a present tense medical loss occurring in real time. Number 8. Incan freeze drying. The food technology 400 years ahead of the West. The Andean Altiplano, the high plateau stretching across Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, produces temperature extremes between day and night during the dry season of 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, freezing nights following intense solar days. The Inca and their predecessors, by approximately 1000 CE, had developed a food preservation technique exploiting these extremes. Chuño, the preserved potato product central to Andean cuisine and logistics, was produced by exposing potatoes to repeated freeze-thaw cycles of Andean nights and days, combined with treading to remove water, producing a shelf-stable product that had lost 80% of its weight and remained nutritionally viable for decades. This is freeze-drying. The fundamental technique: controlled removal of water via freezing, followed by sublimation or mechanical expression, is identical in principle to the freeze-drying technology modern food science and pharmaceutical manufacturing uses for preserving biological materials, vaccines, and long shelf-life products. Freeze-drying, as a formal industrial process, was not developed in the West until the 1940s, when researchers developed it for preserving blood plasma during World War II. The Inca were doing it functionally, at scale, 400 to 600 years before this independent Western development. But here is where the implication extends beyond a historical note. The Inca logistics system, sustaining an empire of 10 million people across 4,000 kilometers of Andean terrain without wheeled transport, depended on chuño as a calorie reserve that could be stored in high-altitude storehouses for years and carried wherever needed. The freeze-drying technology was not a dietary preference. It was the foundation of imperial logistics. Modern military logistics, humanitarian food aid, and pharmaceutical cold chain management are still working with the same physical principles that Andean farmers developed by paying careful attention to what their environment did to potatoes left out overnight. Number 7. Roman battlefield triage, the prioritization system modern medicine reinvented. The modern triage system, formalized in military medicine during the Napoleonic Wars by Surgeon Dominique Jean Larrey, rests on a specific principle. Treatment resources should go first to those injured badly enough to require treatment, but not so badly that treatment will not help. Emergency services globally still use variants of this protocol today. In 2015, emergency medicine researcher Kenneth Iserson published a historical analysis documenting that this same principle, with the same practical methodology, appears in Roman military medical texts from the 1st century CE. Roman military medicine operated through field stations, valetudinaria, with documented protocols for sorting wounded soldiers. Those with minor wounds were treated and returned to duty. Those with serious but survivable wounds were prioritized for surgery. Those with unsurvivable wounds received pain management and were set aside. This is functionally identical to the modern triage color coding system: green for minor, red for serious but treatable, black for unsurvivable. But here is where the specific historical record becomes disturbing. The Roman military medical system represented a level of sophistication in mass casualty management that was not matched in European military medicine for approximately 1,700 years. Medieval European military medicine had no equivalent systematic triage methodology. Soldiers in medieval battles with treatable wounds died at substantially higher rates than Roman soldiers with equivalent wounds, because the organizational framework had been lost. The knowledge existed. It was written down. It was practiced at scale. And then, in the chaos of the Western Empire's collapse, the institutional framework dissolved, and 1,700 years of soldiers died from treatable wounds, while the system that could have saved them sat, documented and unread, in Latin texts in monastery libraries across Europe. Number 6. Chinese smallpox inoculation, the vaccine, 1,000 years before Jenner. Smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone. Its eradication in 1980 is credited to Edward Jenner, who demonstrated protective cowpox inoculation in 1796. What the conventional history underemphasizes: Chinese medical practitioners were performing variolation, deliberate inoculation with material from smallpox pustules, at least as early as the 10th century CE. The technique: collecting dried scabs from mild smallpox cases, powdering them, and introducing the material into a healthy individual through the nostrils or a small skin incision. The procedure produced a typically mild infection that, in the majority of cases, conferred lasting immunity. This is the same technique transmitted from the Ottoman Empire to England through Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in 1721, 75 years before Jenner, which itself had reached the Ottomans from the east. But here is where the knowledge transfer history reveals something specific. Chinese variolation was practiced for centuries before it reached the Ottoman Empire. The transmission from China to the Ottoman world and then to Europe took approximately 800 years. For 800 years, roughly 40 generations, Chinese practitioners were preventing smallpox deaths, while smallpox killed millions in Europe, in a world that was not isolated. The Silk Road connected China to the Mediterranean throughout this entire period, and goods, technologies, and ideas moved along it continuously. Medical knowledge, apparently, did not move as freely as silk. The reason is not geography. It is something about how medical knowledge is valued, transmitted, and received across cultural boundaries that allowed a life-saving technique to sit on the other side of a trade network for 8 centuries, while millions of people died. Number 5. Hippocratic cold water therapy. The protocol modern research is confirming. In the 4th century BCE, Hippocrates and his school on the Greek island of Kos developed systematic protocols for therapeutic cold water immersion, documented in texts including airs, waters, and places, as treatments for fever management, wound recovery, and what the texts describe as nervous system disorders. The protocols were specific: controlled immersion at defined durations, temperatures, and intervals, with documented patient response observations. Modern cryotherapy, cold water immersion, ice baths, cold plunge protocols, is currently one of the most rapidly growing areas of evidence-based research. Studies published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology and Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise have documented reduced exercise-induced inflammation, accelerated muscle recovery, improved autonomic nervous system function, and mood effects in individuals undergoing regular cold water immersion. The specific temperature ranges and durations producing measurable outcomes in modern research are, in several cases, consistent with what the Hippocratic texts prescribed. But here is where the modern rediscovery reveals something more uncomfortable than coincidence. The Hippocratic protocols fell out of systematic medical use during the Middle Ages and were periodically rediscovered, notably by the 19th century German hydrotherapy movement, before being dismissed by the pharmaceutical era of 20th century medicine as unscientific. We are now, with randomized controlled trials and cellular biology studies, producing evidence that confirms what Hippocrates observed in the 4th century BCE through empirical practice. The knowledge was correct, the mechanism was unknown, and the gap between Hippocratic practice and modern clinical validation is approximately 2,400 years, in which medicine had access to a working tool and largely chose not to use it. Number 4. Mesopotamian trauma diagnosis. What modern psychiatry calls PTSD. In 1300 BC, in 2015, a paper published in Early Science and Medicine by Walid Khalid Abdul Hamid and Jamie Hacker Hughes analyzed Assyrian military texts from approximately 1300 BCE. The texts, chronicles of Assyrian military campaigns, and descriptions of returned soldiers' psychological states, contain descriptions of specific symptom clusters. Intrusive memories of battle, appearing during waking hours and during sleep. Startling responses to sounds that were not disturbing before combat. Emotional numbing and withdrawal from social activity. Physical symptoms, including trembling and loss of speech. This is the DSM-5 symptom cluster for post-traumatic stress disorder. The Assyrian texts frame these symptoms as the spirits of killed enemies returning to haunt the soldier, a cultural framework for understanding a psychological reality. But the phenomenological description of what the soldier was experiencing matches the modern diagnostic criteria with a specificity that goes beyond general descriptions of soldiers disturbed by war. But here is where the implications extend beyond historical recognition. The First World War produced hundreds of thousands of cases of shell shock, symptoms identical to those described in the Assyrian texts, in soldiers who were in many cases treated as cowards, court-martialed, and in some cases executed for the symptoms of a condition that Assyrian military administrators had documented and addressed as a medical reality in 1300 BCE. The identification of combat trauma as a treatable medical state rather than a moral failing, present in Assyrian texts, was not consistently present in Western military medicine for most of the subsequent 3,000 years. Number 3. Andean coca pharmacology, precise alkaloid dosing for surgery and altitude. The coca plant, Erythroxylum coca, has been cultivated in the Andean region for at least 8,000 years, based on archaeological recovery from sites including Huaca Prieta in Peru, dated to approximately 6000 BCE. Traditional use combines coca leaves with lime, calcium carbonate, whose alkaline environment releases cocaine alkaloids from the leaf matrix, dramatically increasing bioavailability. This chemistry is sophisticated. The relationship between pH, alkaloid extraction, and bioavailability is taught in university organic chemistry. Andean practitioners arrived at the optimal lime-to-leaf ratio through thousands of years of observation. Without molecular chemistry, without knowledge of alkaloids, without any of the conceptual framework that would allow a modern chemist to predict this result theoretically. Traditional Andean surgical practice used coca preparations for pain management during procedures including trepanation. Skull surgery documented at over 800 Peruvian archaeological sites, with survival rates of approximately 80%. The coca alkaloids produced local anesthesia at the site of application, a property independently discovered by Western medicine when Karl Kohler demonstrated cocaine's use as a local anesthetic in 1884. But here is where the full sophistication becomes apparent. Traditional Andean coca knowledge included differentiated uses for different preparations, dosages, and administration routes. Altitude sickness, fatigue management, surgical pain, ceremonial use. This differentiation reflects an understanding of dose-response relationships that is one of the fundamental principles of clinical pharmacology. Andean communities had been applying dose-response thinking to a specific alkaloid for 8,000 years before Western medicine isolated cocaine as a distinct chemical compound. The compound we named and patented was being managed as a complete pharmacological system on the other side of the world, across the entirety of recorded human history. Number 2. The Ebers papyrus and the lymphatic system. Egypt's discovery 1,500 years before the West. In 1862, the German Egyptologist Georg Ebers purchased a papyrus scroll in Luxor that would become the most comprehensive medical document from ancient Egypt. The Ebers papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, is 20 meters long and contains 877 medical prescriptions, surgical descriptions, and anatomical observations. Among the anatomical observations, a description of vessels distinct from blood vessels, channels carrying a clear fluid described as separate from blood, connecting the intestines to the body's fluid management system, responding to infections and injuries in specific ways. The lymphatic system was formally described in Western anatomy in the 17th century. Jean Piquet described the thoracic duct in 1647. Thomas Bartholin named and systematically described the lymphatic system in 1652. The Ebers papyrus contains a functional description of lymphatic vessels 1,500 years before this. But here is where the significance extends beyond historical priority. The clinical implications of the lymphatic system, its role in immune response, in the spread of infection, in inflammatory conditions, are applied in the Ebers papyrus in specific treatment protocols. Treatments for conditions involving swelling, infection, and fluid accumulation address the lymphatic involvement in those conditions with a logic that matches what modern medicine understands about how those conditions work. The Egyptian physicians were not simply making anatomical observations. They were applying them clinically, in specific treatment protocols, for specific patient presentations, documented in a systematic reference text apparently in active clinical use. The papyrus is in the University Library of Leipzig. It has been available to Western scholars since the 19th century. The full clinical sophistication of its content is still being recognized. Number 1. Ayurvedic pulse diagnosis. 5,000 years of cardiovascular knowledge confirmed by modern research. In approximately 3000 BCE, practitioners in the South Asian cultural sphere that would eventually produce the Ayurvedic medical tradition developed a diagnostic system centered on systematic palpation of the radial pulse, the pulse felt at the wrist where the radial artery passes near the surface. The Ayurvedic system, documented in texts including the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, describes 12 distinct pulse qualities at 3 depths of palpation. Each combination corresponds to the functional state of a specific organ system. Rapid, bounding pulse at the superficial level, heat and inflammatory states. Slow, deep pulse at the deepest level, specific organ deficiencies. The diagnostics are specific, systematic, and internally consistent. Western medicine dismissed pulse diagnosis beyond simple rate measurement as unscientific throughout most of the 20th century. But here is where the modern research produces a finding that demands serious attention. Heart rate variability, HRV, is the variation in time intervals between successive heartbeats, now recognized as one of the most sensitive, measurable indicators of autonomic nervous system function and overall physiological health. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation and Circulation has documented that specific HRV patterns correlate with the functional states of specific organ systems, cardiac, hepatic, renal, pulmonary, with diagnostic accuracy that makes HRV analysis a clinically validated tool in cardiology, anesthesiology, and critical care medicine. The Ayurvedic pulse diagnosis system, 12 pulse qualities correlating to specific organ states, assessed through trained finger palpation of the radial artery, is, in functional terms, a non-instrumented approach to detecting the same physiological signals that modern HRV analysis detects electronically. A trained Ayurvedic pulse diagnostician's fingers at the radial artery are doing what a modern cardiac monitor does when it calculates HRV. The information is the same. The transducer is different. The Charaka Samhita was compiled in its current form approximately 2,000 years ago. The tradition it documents is older. The physiological reality it describes was confirmed by modern instrumented research in the late 20th century. And the specific diagnostic correlations, dismissed by modern medicine for most of the 20th century, are being validated, one, by the same clinical research tradition that dismissed them. The pulse is still at your wrist. The information it carries was being read there by trained practitioners 5,000 years before the cardiologist's monitoring equipment was invented. When the monitor reads that information, it confirms what the Ayurvedic texts said it would say. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.